Ladies and gentlemen, grab your drinks and popcorn. Today's feature is about to begin. Welcome to Celluloid Codswallop. Hello and welcome to this week's Celluloid Codswallop, and this definitely is a Celluloid Codswallop episode this time. We're not mixing Talking Codswallop with Celluloid Codswallop, though Gemma isn't here and she'll feel bad about that. She has asked me to apologise in advance to the guest I have on this episode, but by God, this is a good one. This is the guest I've got on for this week is Steve Rubin. And I know I've been mocked numerous times for saying this when I make the comment about someone being a multi-talented threat, or I say that someone who has multiple skills. Steve wears many, many hats, and I really do mean he wears many, many hats. So, firstly, Steve, thank you for coming on. How are you doing?
I'm great, James. It's great to be here. I have to ask you a question. The word codswallop is not well known in Los Angeles. Is that the name of one of the characters in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory? Because isn't there a guy named Codswallop, or was that the name of the candy that he produced, or am I completely mixing it up with something else?
I think you might be mixing it up with something else. I think codswallop here it's generally described as using a term where you kind of talking rubbish or nonsense. So we decided Talking Codswallop could be quite a funny way, or Gemma did. It was her creation of a name.
Got it. Okay, perfect. Maybe his name was Godswallop, or it was some kind of swallop, but the idea of talking nonsense is perfectly in tune with me because I spend most of my life talking in arcane, nonsensical ways. So we're perfectly in tune. Excellent.
Now, the first question I'm going to ask you, and obviously, as I said, and I don't know if I said it, but I will say it again. Thank you for coming on. Tell us a bit about yourself. What's your background, Steve?
Okay. I was born in Chicago, Illinois. My father hated the winters there, so he moved out to sunny California where his brother had a business. And at the age of 4, I was one of the first people to ever go to Disneyland. It opened in 1955. And there I was. I was one of the first attendees. So I got bitten with a little fantasy there. Went to school. Loved movies all my life. From the ages of 5 to 10, I lived across the street from a movie theater. So I literally lived at the movie theater, mostly on the weekends, but my parents would take me there for adult films. And when I say adult films, I just mean not kids' films as opposed to porno. And love movies. My mother was particularly a movie buff. She loved all the actresses and actors from the golden age. So before I was learning ABCs, I was learning Clark Gable, Vivian Leigh, David Niven. And then when I went to school, I became a writer for my college newspaper. I spent 2 years at UCLA, junior and senior year. And I got a degree in history. When I got out of college, I wanted to write something. They say write about something that you're interested in and that you can contribute to. So of all things, I picked World War II combat films, films about World War II. So I started looking for people to interview because I wanted to learn the behind-the-scenes histories of how these classic war films were made. And my research at that time was the Beverly Hills phone directory. In those days, they actually listed people. And I found a screenwriter named Michael Blankfort. Now, this name probably doesn't mean anything to anybody, but he was a blacklisted screenwriter during that period in Hollywood where they were investigating communist subversion. But he wrote one of my favorite films of the 1950s, a film that is lesser known today, but it's called Halls of Montezuma, which is with Richard Widmark. It's about the U.S. Marines fighting the Japanese on a Pacific island. But Michael filled in a lot of the interesting behind-the-scenes information for me. For instance, Richard Boone, the great character actor, is playing a lieutenant in the movie, and he has a cold. And his big character trait is he can't stop sneezing. He's fighting World War II, but he's also got a cold. So Michael told me that he actually gave that idea to the actor to give him a little bit more presence rather than just being another soldier. So these are the kind of behind-the-scenes bits that nobody had ever heard before, which intrigued me. Now, about the same time, I subscribed to a magazine out of Chicago called Cine Fantastique. Now, Cine Fantastique, you'll recall, was a major film magazine, the first to cover science fiction, fantasy, and horror movies. So I had been doing some research for my World War II book, and I came across a writer who also wrote a movie called Them. Now, I don't know if you remember Them. Them was a movie that was Warner Brothers released in 1954 about gigantic ants in the New Mexico desert. So once again, Ted told me interesting things about this movie, and Fred Clark, the editor of this magazine, asked me to write an article. So that article came out. Now, what was interesting is I went to Warner Brothers and I needed to illustrate the article. Now, I actually told them about the magazine. I told them about the article, and they invited me in to look at the key still book. And in the key still book, they had behind-the-scenes shots of Them. Now, no one on the planet had ever seen a behind-the-scenes shot from Them as far as I knew. So when the article was published and those photographs appear, there was fan mail. I got my first fan mail. And Fred was very pleased with the reaction and the level of the research, because I also interviewed Gordon Douglas, the director. So I got some good insight. And my next assignment, I spent 6 months on. Actually, it was not the next, but one of my assignments. I did Forbidden Planet. I did The Day the Earth Stood Still. The Day the Earth Stood Still article took 6 months, and I interviewed everybody alive who worked on that movie, including director Robert Wise and producer Julie Blaustein, Edmund North. Edmund North actually told me what Klaatu Barada Nikto means. You know, we've been wandering around for decades, wondering what the hell Klaatu's saying to his giant steel robot, or at least what Patricia Neal is asked to say to the giant steel robot. And Edmund North said it means there's hope for Earth if the scientists can be reached. How about that, huh? That's
yes, I like that. I like that a lot. And that's a very apt thing if you look at life in general, even now.
Yeah, I mean, so as I kind of started calling myself a film archaeologist, because in a way, instead of going into an ancient Egyptian tomb, I was going into classic movies and doing my research, and I had a lot of fun. I mentioned Forbidden Planet when I decided to do a behind-the-scenes story about Forbidden Planet, which is one of the great science fiction movies of all time. Yeah. I was told to go see a person named Bill Malone, and Bill Malone was a film director in Studio City, and when I walked into his den for my interview, guess who's standing there? Robbie the Robot, the original Robbie the Robot. I nearly fell over. I mean, I walked over and shook hands with him. And Bill, this is 1974. So this is 48 years ago. Bill is still one of my closest friends. I'm working with him on one of his directing projects, trying to get it produced. But it's these kinds of stories of being exposed to the colorful history of Hollywood really got me excited about working in the business. But I learned early on, James, that I could not make a living doing this. I mean, for instance, that article on The Day There Is Stood Still, I really didn't make any money for it. I mean, they gave me extra copies of the magazines to sell at conventions, but I was doing it for the pure love. So I had to get a day job. So I was very fortunate. I actually became a publicist in Hollywood back in the 70s. My first assignment was to be hired by United Artists and director Phil Kaufman to promote a movie, the remake of Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the Donald Sutherland, Leonard Nimoy remake. And my job was to go around to science fiction conventions all over the United States, put up a table, show slides, and share information about this new movie. So once again, I found an opportunity to just get involved in filmmaking and share secrets about the movie. And I did that for 10 months. And then I went to work in a PR agency to carry on that kind of duty. And then I discovered there was a craft in Hollywood on film sets called a unit publicist, where the film crew has its own publicist. So I got that job and ended up doing that for 20 years.
Can I take you back to something that really got my attention? Because obviously I knew the kind of the publicist work and things you'd done, but you were pretty much there for the birth of the convention scene, if you're going to things that early. So what was it like that early on when you were doing them?
Well, actually, when I mentioned the fact that I was making very little money for my articles, Fred Clark, the editor, would give me literally a stack of all the back issues. And since these weren't readily available, I would set up a table at a convention and sell issues, and Fred would split the money with me, which was a little form of a payday for me, which was great. But it was very low-key. Science fiction conventions would get maybe 1,000, maybe 2,000 people. I went down to San Diego Comic-Con for Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and there were about 500 people there. 500 people. They get about 500 people a minute now. You know, I mean, they have 150,000 people at these conventions. So the circuit was popular and enthusiastic, but not as massively attended as some of the conventions are today. I learned early on, though, that one of the promotional items for Invasion of the Body Snatchers were bumper stickers, you know, to get kids excited. But I learned that was a bad idea because they were sticking them on elevators, and the hotel was furious about that. So that didn't quite work.
So things haven't changed too much on that. You'll always get people sticking things pro where they shouldn't go. Because at one stage we had talking codswallop stickers that Gemma created, and they were getting stuck all over the place.
Exactly. It's funny. Promotional items can be fun. Let's see. 5 years later, I was assigned to a Columbia 3D movie called Space Hunter: Adventures in the Forbidden Zone, which was kind of it was a movie that was released kind of in the shadow of Return of the Jedi in the summer of 1983. It did well its opening weekend. It was Molly Ringwald's second movie. And
I thought so. When you mentioned the name, I kept thinking, why is it familiar? And I've seen she's got short hair in it. Yeah.
So we created 3D buttons. So that was cool. We passed out thousands of 3D buttons. And I actually, Ivan Reitman was the lead producer. And I convinced the studio to let me take a national tour out. Now, having done the Body Snatchers tour, which was basically me flying into cities, this time we got a big panel truck, painted the name of the movie on the side of the truck, and then we had a trailer behind it carrying these futuristic vehicles from Space Hunter. So we actually drove on the road for 63 days cross country, exhibiting at fairs and convention centers. So it was a lot of fun. It was very challenging. The concept of physically going on national tours is not as popular anymore because it's not as cost effective. You know, you take one TV ad on national television, you can reach more people in 5 minutes than I reached in 63 days. But it was a different form of promotion in those days.
I mean, yeah, you can hear from what you're saying that it's a massive change in promotion, but obviously that's quite an effective way of looking at doing it, the way you did it at that point, isn't it? To show something that you've got, because if you think about going to a convention and when films come out at certain places, certainly when they have the premieres, people will gravitate to vehicles and things from the film because it immediately gets their attention. And if it's sci-fi, it's different.
Well, if you've seen the movie, Peter Strauss, the lead actor, drives what is called the Scrambler, which is kind of an all-terrain vehicle. It was actually a pickup truck they made into a futuristic vehicle. So that was on our tour with us. So we arrive in Washington, D.C. Now, you have to picture this, James. On the top of the Scrambler is a rather large laser cannon. Mm-hmm. So I came up with this brilliant idea that I was going to be arrested in front of the White House pointing a laser cannon at the White House. Of course, this is something you couldn't do within 3 miles of that place. Back in 1983, there was actually a street in front of the White House. It wasn't blocked off as it is these days. So I parked the car, the Scrambler. First of all, you have to understand, this is an illegal vehicle to drive anywhere. There's no instrumentation. You can't tell what's going on. It's supposed to be, utilized in a movie on a set in the desert. I'm driving it down Pennsylvania Avenue. People are looking at me crazy. I parked it in front of the White House, and nothing happened. Nothing. Now, today, every Secret Service and security person in Washington would have been down on me. I would have been on the sidewalk, handcuffed. But back in 1983, there was a ho-hum moment. So I didn't achieve my goal of getting in the national newspapers. But it just shows you how wacky I was thinking. I was thinking in kind of a codswallop kind of way.
I think it's exceptionally good thinking, but I'm also going to be honest, I'm kind of glad you weren't. It didn't get their attention, because I think you might run the risk of being shot, to be fair.
I'll tell you a funny story. My son and his friends are all young filmmakers. Mm-hmm. So they like to go off in the woods and make little films. Like young boys, they're always carrying facsimiles of automatic rifles and handguns, as boys will do. I kind of wince a little bit sometimes, but one day they're up in the woods near my house in Los Angeles, and they said, Dad, we need a getaway car. Can you drive up bring the Prius up to, I have a little Prius. They bring the Prius up there and we'll take it. So I drive, as the dutiful dad, I drive the car up to the woods there. This is right behind the Getty Center, which is a big art center in Los Angeles. And they come walking out to the car carrying their rifles. I said, "Are you insane? You can't walk around with those things." The words were still coming out of my mouth, and I looked up, and there was a helicopter above me. And within 3 minutes, there were 4 police cars, and we were all down on the sidewalk, handcuffed. And wow. They don't waste any time. The Getty Center has a lot of security cameras. Mm. They saw kids coming out of the forest with automatic weapons. You can imagine what they were thinking. So we had to talk our way out of that very quickly. We ended up getting a slap on the wrist, not getting the proper permits to be shooting any kind of short film. So we all learned our lesson. But you haven't really lived until you're sitting on a sidewalk, handcuffed, and they say, "Get up," and you say, "How?"
I'm glad nothing bad came from it, but yeah. As soon as you mentioned the walking with guns, I thought this could end interestingly.
Yes, you see, I'm quite a disruptor here. Now I'm very anti-gun. In fact, all the writing I'm doing right now is comedy. I'm focusing as a screenwriter on writing comedies with my partners. I have 2 different partners. One we write animated comedy, one we write live action comedy, and we're staying away with any type of gunplay.
No, totally understandable. You obviously said that you got into writing the articles, and you got into working as a publicist. When you were a child, what was it you wanted to do? I'm always intrigued to learn what people wanted to do. I at one stage wanted to be a vet. I also wanted to be Optimus Prime at one point, but that never happened. That never worked out. So,
cost of the medal alone would have been ruined. Well, let's see. I love planes when I was growing up, so I thought about aeronautical engineer. But when I took drafting class in middle school, I couldn't draw a straight line to save my life. I was the one who was always using the eraser the most. And then I thought about archaeologists. After seeing, reading all about how you're looking for these ancient artifacts, that sounded fascinating until I saw one of those mummy movies, and there were snakes and spiders and mummies running around. I said, "Nah, I don't think I want to do that." So that fell by the side. There's a lot of pressure on students today when you're in school that you've got to know exactly what you want to do. I can say categorically, when I finished college, I didn't have a clue. I thought about television news broadcasting because I had written for my college paper, but the idea of shoving microphones in people's faces did not sound very appetizing. I thought about teaching. I kind of did a lot of little jobs. I was a parking lot attendant. I was a delivery man. All different odd jobs. I was a host at a restaurant. I was kind of biding my time until I found something I was really passionate about. And then I discovered all along that it was right there in front of me, a love of movies. And I was able to translate that into a paying career for 30 years as a publicist. I've made some money from writing. I'm not going to deny that. But for those 30 years, PR was my mainstay.
So on to writing, I'm going to ask you a writing-based question, which is you have created a trilogy of James Bond. I will deem them as like reference books, if that would be the right terminology, which is the James Bond films of behind-the-scenes history, the complete James Bond Movie Encyclopaedia, and the James Bond Movie Encyclopaedia. So I know I've hit you with the three books you've written, so to ask you all about that in one encompassing question is probably going to be rather tricky, but I can only imagine one of the most challenging aspects of them is obviously doing the research for them. But prior to that, I want to know what made you choose them as your books. I'm going to assume, logically, you are a Bond fan, so how did you get into the Bond? Because when I've read up on things you've done, you originally were interested in the Bond novels. That's how you became aware of them.
Like most middle school students, I love the Bond novels. It's a funny story because my father would go on business trips and he would bring home Westerns. I had no interest in reading Westerns because there were like 2,000 of them on TV every week. That was the 1950s and early 1960s. Westerns were king. But one day in 1964, he threw a book on my desk with a picture of a naked woman on the cover. She was covered in gold paint, and she was positioned in a way that it wasn't really pornographic, but it was called Goldfinger. And I said, "What's that?" He said, "You might like that." So he hands me Goldfinger, and I read it, and you're talking about a 12-year-old boy reading Goldfinger. Now, I was a rather sheltered only child. I did not have sisters, so women had really not entered my life to any heavy repetition. So this was kind of my exposure to kind of sex and sexiness, etc. And then, of course, that Christmas of '64, Goldfinger, the movie, came out. When I went to see that, and we didn't go to the Chinese theater very often, if ever. So this was a big event to go up to the Chinese theater in Hollywood and see Goldfinger. Talk about a seminal experience for me to see that movie. Probably one of the sexiest movies ever. And to this day, my favorite Bond movie. So it hasn't changed in all these years. Those were great inspirations for me to love the Bond movies. And like everybody else, we all went crazy for James Bond. By 1977, there had only been one book done on the Bond movies. It was a British author named John Brosnan's James Bond in the Cinema, which was more of a kind of a tribute to the series as opposed to a researched behind-the-scenes history. So I had gotten my combat films book finished, but it did not sell any real serious copies. So I was looking for a subject that would appeal to more than just a few World War II movie fans. And it dawned on me that I could apply the same kind of research I'd done for the Cinefantastique articles to the world of James Bond. So what did I do? I made an appointment to see Albert R. Broccoli. He's kind of the godfather of James Bond.
How? Because now that'd be impossible. So.
Yeah, it was just a case of, I'm not quite sure exactly what happened, but I did call up MGM. I asked to speak to Mr. Broccoli's office. I explained who I was. I was a film historian. I had just written combat films. I talked to him about I'm thinking of writing a book about the Bonds. And I must have caught Cubby on a good day because I got an interview with him, and he seemed pleased enough to invite me to London and to meet his stepson, Michael Wilson. And Michael Wilson opened all the doors for me. He actually opened the filing cabinets at Ian and Audley Square, and I was able to get the call sheets for the first 10 films. Now, when you're researching the history of a movie, the call sheet is like a Rosetta Stone. It tells you who was working that day, what they were working on, who the extras were, what the order of business was. So it's like a terrific little diary of it. So I could say that on January 3rd, Goldfinger was shooting in this place, or Dr. No was shooting in that place. So it really became the fundamental basis for a lot of the background information I gathered. And then, of course, I did interviews after interviews. I arrived in London just after they wrapped The Spy Who Loved Me. So I wasn't able to see the filming, but Michael and Ken Adam, the wonderful production designer, drove me out to Pinewood Studios in Ken's Rolls Royce. I felt like a member of royalty. And we saw one of the first screenings of The Spy Who Loved Me. And I just loved that movie. It was just so exciting to see it in this Pinewood Studios screening room. I felt so privileged. And I think I was on a backpacking trip that summer after my research was finished, and I was driving across Spain, and I heard Carly Simon's song for the first time. So Nobody Does It Better. So that was exciting.
Hell of a song. I love The Spy Who Loved Me. For me, Bond is just, it's always been something that's been in my life and always been something that's interested me. Now, for me, my favourite Bond is The Living Daylights. I can watch that. Well, let's be honest, I've watched that film more times than I care to even think about. And for me, Tim Dalton's an absolutely brilliant Bond. But it's when you met the Broccoli family and you got to interact with them, what were they like as people? Because I'm never going to get to meet them, I don't think. So,
well, I sometimes refer to Albert R. Broccoli as the Godfather of Bond. He is the Godfather of Bond. I mean, you walk into this enormous office in the administration building at MGM Studios, now of course Sony Studios, and he's sitting behind his desk. I mean, this is Albert R. Broccoli. I mean, this is a guy who's a legend in the business. Slow talking, serious. Was interested that I was interested in behind the scenes information. I'm sure he had done interviews before, but I'm kind of a forensic interviewer. I go into very specific details about how things came together. And he told me about his efforts to get involved with the Bond early on and how he eventually had to hook up with Harry Saltzman, who had the rights. And they went to Columbia Pictures because Cubby had great relationships with Columbia. They had been releasing the movies he had been making with Irving Allen. Irving Allen was his partner in Warwick Pictures in London. They made a lot of adventure films with Alan Ladd and Victor Mature. But Irving Allen did not like the Bond idea, so he was forced to look elsewhere, and he ended up hooking up with Harry. So all that was very interesting to me in terms of learning the early history of the James Bond movies. And now we're talking 60 years of history. So I feel like I've done a good stewardship of presenting that history over the course. You call it a trilogy, but the first book, the James Bond Films Behind the Scenes History, which was the first book I wrote when I interviewed Cubby, that was renewed. I revived it for a second edition. The Encyclopedia is pretty much 4 different editions. The latest one is the 4th edition of that encyclopedia, which is currently out now and includes No Time to Die, as much of it that I could get because I was about to see the movie, but unfortunately they pushed it again. So it's very hard to bring out your encyclopedia not having seen the movie, but I think I have enough fun stuff in there, plus some good photographs. So that's the 4th edition, and I needed to do a 4th edition because I had not done one since 2003. So I'd missed all the Craigs, and of course the Craigs are very critical.
And what would you say when you talk about interviewing people? Who has been the most rewarding person for you to speak to on a personal level?
Well, the early interviews were like opening a door to a new world for me, because I didn't know much about the behind-the-scenes history because there was nothing much out there. So one of my favorite interviews was with Terrence Young, who directed Dr. No, From Russia with Love, and Thunderball. I mean, what a storyteller he was. I mean, he's a rather dashing fellow. In fact, Terrence Young in another incarnation could easily have been James Bond. He was definitely a guy who knew the right wines, and he knew how to party. And talk about a dashing guy. I mean, he was a tank officer in the British Army during World War II. He was with the Guards Armored Division, which was very active on the Western Front. So, his tutelage was he worked early on under the mentorship of John Ford. So I think that Terrence Young brought a lot of interesting skills to movie making. And I can't think of a better director to direct 3 of the first James Bond movies, 3 of the 4.
Well, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but for the fact that to kind of get Connery looking more suave, Terrence Young was quite instrumental in helping him do that, wasn't he? Is that true? I believe the comment about he got him to obviously go to the correct Savile Row tailor, told him to sleep in the suit sort of thing, to become more one with it, shall we say? So it became more of a second skin almost.
Oh, yeah, to say Sean Connery was a little unpolished when he came to Bond is a great understatement. In fact, there was rather disparaging comments made about Sean Connery when he first got the role in America, which can be very insulting at times. They called him that limey truck driver. It's like they had no respect for him whatsoever. They wanted stars. They wanted Burt Lancaster. They wanted Jimmy Stewart. They wanted Frank Sinatra. Who the heck is Sean Connery? In fact, there's a story. I don't know if this is entirely true, but in France, Sean Connery sounds a little bit like Sean Connery, which I guess translated means without balls. So whenever we hear the name Sean Connery, they would laugh. Now, I don't know if that's entirely true, but because I don't speak fluent French, but I'm sure somebody will explain that to me. But I think that if you go back and you see the early James Bond movies, Dr. No, From Russia with Love, Goldfinger, Thunderball, Connery was such a revelation in that role, just star maker all across the board. And unlike some of the other actors in Bond that haven't really done many other things, Connery did some wonderful other projects. I mean, when he passed away a couple years ago, it was like to use a Star Wars term, something was a disturbance in the force, because Connery was a force. Mm-hmm. And we all miss him. He was wonderful in literally everything he ever did.
The presence, I never met him, but as I understand it, he's somebody who had real presence throughout his life. He'd go in a room, you would know. And he definitely was somebody who would never back down from someone.
I did find it interesting recently to learn that the tallest James Bond is Timothy Dalton.
Yep. I think he's the same height I am, 6'2.5". I think we're the same height. I like Timothy. To be honest, this is just my personal opinion. I don't think he was totally right for Bond. I think that he was kind of a little mixture. I think he was very serious, so he had the Connery side down. But he didn't. People don't go to Bond movies entirely for the seriousness. They like the funny lines. They like the little double entendres. They certainly like the romance. And I don't think Timothy was as comfortable, at least yet, in that aspect. And as you and I've talked about, as much as I thought Living Daylights was really a terrific Bond movie, I was not a fan of License to Kill. I thought it played like a Miami Vice episode. And I thought that it was not the world that Bond should travel in, even though there are some great things in License to Kill. I mean, the whole relationship between him and the pilot, Pam Bouvier, was, I thought, terrific. And I thought Robert Davi was a very, very good villain. Just the whole caper about about all that drug stuff was just, to me, a little dull. And I can see where people will have that. And, I will love Dalton's work. But again, I totally see what you mean, because when you look at License to Kill, I can watch and enjoy it as a Bond film, but there are elements, the times when I'm watching it, I'm feeling this isn't feeling as Bondian as it probably should. And I think, as you said, it was trying to probably go for that almost Miami Vice style. Because I also understand they were trying to get into like pastel colours, which would not have worked.
It's interesting. When you make a James Bond movie, you have to check a lot of boxes. Now, the boxes have changed over the years. The term sexy probably has been the most dramatic change, because what you could do in 1964 in Goldfinger, you can't go within 20 miles of today. That scene in Goldfinger where you meet James Bond being massaged by Dink, and he slaps her on the bottom and says, "Man talk." You do that today, you get your hands removed. It's not going to happen. And I just think the sexiness of the early Bond movies has been replaced by violence. Now the movies are much more violent, in keeping with what the other film series are doing. See, the thing was, when James Bond appeared for the first time in the early 60s, there was virtually no competition. Now you've got to deal with the Mission Impossible movies. You've got to deal with the Bourne movies. You've got to deal, even the Kingsman series, which is a little more light, it still has a lot of trickery that steals a note from Bond. So the producers, in trying to come up with stuff for a new Bond movie, have to find things that are harder to find. I give them a lot of credit. I know that No Time to Die has been very controversial for many people. But I thought on the big screen, it was definitely big screen entertainment. The reason we go to the big screen is to see movies like No Time to Die.
Yeah, it was certainly for me. No Time to Die was, how can I put this nicely? I enjoyed it, elements of it. I used some rather choice language at the end of it. Which the people around me were rather shocked by. We will not use the language because I want to keep us so everyone can listen to us. But there was a very strong expletive used by me. Upon further viewings of it, and I could watch it at home and things, I have warmed to it more. But I will say, I think they've got it, the way they did it, to be fair, is brilliant, to actually make it a self-contained selection of films for Craig. It takes balls to if you haven't seen it, people, tough, to kill him off at the end, of No Time to Die. It takes guts, because initially when I didn't like it, I stepped back and looked at it and thought, well, they've done something that no one ever expected to happen. And probably a bit more element of realism, because let's be honest, he would die at some, to be fair, Bond would be dead in the first 5 minutes. It was full in complete reality, but he would, so there's got to be a point where he would be killed off.
Well, I disagree with their decision. I don't think it had to be that way, but they set it up that it kind of had to be that way. I don't think James Bond goes through life with a wife and kids. That's not the James Bond we want to see. So you can't have it. When they reboot the series, and they undoubtedly will reboot it in a big way with a new actor playing Bond, he's going to go back to being a lone wolf. It's just that has to be that way. That's what we expect. That's one of the boxes we check off when we see a Bond movie. We want to see a lone wolf operator. It's got to have and then the other thing that I think is very critical, which I think in a sense was a little bit of a letdown, especially with No Time to Die, is the villain has to be just terrific and just really. And I thought, listen, we're all big fans of Rami, but I don't think his part was written very well. And there was not much for him to do other than to mumble. And I think that there could have been more to that. To this day, someone has to explain to me why he wants to destroy the world, because I'm not quite sure yet.
I actually think it would have had more impact if the end, again, if you've not seen it, you can either pause us and watch it, or you're going to have to suck it up, listeners. But the fact that when, Safin is killed by Bond, to me, it would have made more sense and had more emotional impact if it had been Blofeld.
That's another thing, right? I mean, Blofeld just kind of was a throwaway in the movie. there were things that are off, but I will say this: even with things being off, getting 2+ hours of Daniel Craig as Bond is a terrific joy, because the thing that Daniel Craig has done for the last 16 years is just he's brought the character to a whole new dimension and a new audience, and that is so difficult. That is so difficult, and you got to give the producers credit for hanging in there in the most difficult times. But Craig is an artist, and I can't tell you how big a fan I am. When I say that Goldfinger is my favorite Bond movie, right next to it in like a tie for first place would be the first Craig, which is Casino Royale, which I think is just a marvelous Bond movie.
And how did you feel when Craig was first unveiled? I'm going to be honest, I was like, okay. I couldn't get it. And then obviously when I saw the first teaser trailer, I was like, now I get it. And also when I got to see Layer Cake, I was like, I get it now. Before I saw Casino Royale, I was like, Layer Cake, right, I totally understand this casting. It makes sense.
Yeah, we kind of disparaged him a little bit. We called him the Blonde Bond, which wasn't exactly the most favorable thing to say about Daniel. We didn't know much about him at all. I had not seen Layer Cake. I think I saw him briefly in one of the Tomb Raider movies. I think he's in one of the Tomb Raider movies. He's certainly in the Spielberg movie about Munich. Yeah. But my jaw dropped during that first chase sequence on the construction train with the parkour. Oh, my God, that just blew me away. And Craig is a no-nonsense Bond. Some people refer to him as being somewhat thuggish, which I think is an interesting way of looking at it. This is not a polished guy who sits there and, trades quips with people. He's good with his fists, and he's good with taking care of business. And I think that is a harken back to the early Connery, because Connery wasn't, even though he did order the right wines at times, he could take people down with their fist.
Yeah, he was definitely not in the sort of frame of when you look at someone like Pierce Brosnan. That was, I think, the other big thing. We'd seen this huge shift between the suave. I mean, to me, still, the greatest scene for me for Brosnan is in GoldenEye when he's sat being dressed down in M's office by M. I just can watch that thing again and again. I just think it's an absolutely brilliant scene to see. And I don't quite think we would have, I don't think we could have had such a similar scene with, say, Daniel Craig's iteration of Bond. But when it's come to interviewing people who, like the actors and actresses for the Bond films, for the people who worked in them, what's been the most challenging and rewarding on that, would you say?
Well, I have to say it's very loaded towards the Connerys. I did not do as many interviews later in, because I never talked to Craig. I never talked to Brosnan. I got some questions answered by Moore. I'd say that it's very challenging to get people to commit to interviews because they've been interviewed so many times. I mean, when I did my first James Bond book, as I mentioned, there were no James Bond books. Mm-hmm. Now there are literally dozens of James Bond books, and many of them have done interviews. So I pull some of my stuff off of the internet. If they're good interviews, I'll take some of the quotes. In writing the encyclopedia, it's more about organizing and presenting interesting information that people don't know. And I think what's fun about the new edition of the James Bond Movie Encyclopedia is the photographic research I did. I have over 400 photos in the book, many in color for the first time, because I never could afford to have color in the other books. And I have to thank people all over the world who contributed to the book in terms of what they supplied photographs-wise. If you decide to do a book on film and you need photographs, if you go to the studio and say, I need a photograph of Tomb Raider, they'll charge you $300 for one photo. So if I had to buy photos for this book, the book would have never been published. These photos were all given to me for free by friends all over the world. And I can't tell you how grateful I am to them for supplying me with these photos. And because I'm an historical researcher, I'm not just writing a picture book. I use the photos in a fair use manner. In the U.S. copyright system, I know this is getting technical, but yeah, I'm allowed to use photographs if I'm trying to make an historical point. So if I talk about the Disco Volante hovercraft in Thunderball, and I show a photo of the Disco Volante hovercraft in Thunderball, that's okay. And so far, so good in terms of any legal response. And the book is done well around the world.
I also would love to know, Steve, because you mentioned, we obviously discussed the fact that for you, getting into Bond was from the novels. So that's obviously Fleming's work. What's your view been on the continuation novels that have been done by other authors like Gardner and Benson and people like that?
Well, I guess I'm a Fleming snob because I stopped. I did pick up one Gardner. And I think I read Colonel's Son by Kingsley Amis, and it just wasn't the same for me. So I literally haven't cracked open a Bond novel. Even Ray Benson, who's a friend of mine, I should at least read some of his work, but I never have. I apologize, Ray. But
they are good, Steve. They are good. I promise you, Raymond Benson's work is good.
It's funny because I just reread Goldfinger for the first time since 1964. And I really enjoyed it, although I noticed how markedly different it was from the movie. And, of course, we have a lot to thank Richard Maybaum, the great screenwriter, who wrote a bunch of the Bonds and wrote perhaps the best Bonds for how they changed things, because they changed them much for the better.
Now, I have to, other than the fact that I'm incredibly envious of you for getting to speak to people who've been involved and have involvement in the Bond world, I have to be really, really honest with you and say I'm so envious it's untrue on this. So there is a picture I found of you, a wonderful picture. You have a glorious moustache, and you are stood with my ultimate crush, Jane Seymour. I am so jealous of you. It is untrue.
Well, I talk about serendipitous. I was writing an article for the LA Times in anticipation of my book being published called Whatever Happened to All the James Bond Women or James Bond Girls? And I interviewed a bunch of them. And then after interviewing Jane Seymour, her publicist called and asked if I remember this. She said, "Would you like to take some photographs with Jane?" I said, okay. And it became the back cover image for my book. I have to say that Jane was wonderful. And my friend Bill Malone, who I was telling you, who owned Robbie the Robot, he came out and shot some great shots. And that was a glorious day.
Yeah, God, I'd love to meet her so much, but I think I probably got very tongue-tied. I think I fell in love with her as Solitaire, and I fell in love with her even more when she was in Somewhere in Time, Christopher Reeve. What a wonderful woman.
She's pretty funny in Wedding Crashers.
Do you know, I've never seen it.
Oh, yeah, I think you'd find her quite amusing in that movie. Oh. She's a rather randy wife of Christopher Walken. I think
sold.
Definitely.
And Bond connection for both of them, of course. So both Roger Moore, yeah.
That's right.
Who would you put your money on for the next? Who do you think should be the next James Bond?
Well, I tell people these days that not to forget that James Bond is a secret agent. So to start to get back to the mystique, which we got back with Daniel Craig, because nobody really knew who he was, I think we should go with somebody relatively unknown. You know, somebody who doesn't have, a big reputation. I mean, Henry Cavill's name has been, hit a few times. I think he's a safe choice. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure he's the right choice. He's certainly terrific in the things he does. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but we have a series. You're familiar with it. It's called Outlander with Sam Heughan and Christina Balfe. Sam Heughan, I think, is also an interesting choice. He's certainly good looking enough. My wife loves him. The guy who plays Loki in the Hiddleston is a very interesting choice. And I was watching him recently on that show, The Station Manager, I think it's called, or the Hotel.
The Night Manager? Is it the Night Manager?
Thank you. Yeah. The Night Manager. He's very interesting. You know, he's not a big physical type, but then again, Daniel Craig wasn't either. You know, they kind of grew into the role. he's interesting. But I think that there's a lot of pressure since the movies cost so much and the movie prices have gone so astronomical. When I did my research and found out that Dr. No, which is by no means a small movie, it takes place all over the Caribbean and in London, cost $1 million in 1962.
That's substantial then, yeah.
And of course, No Time Today was approaching $300 million. So when you're spending that kind of crazy sum of money, they have to be safe. So sometimes they pick somebody they think will carry the film a little bit better. But they didn't with Daniel Craig. I don't think Daniel Craig was a safe choice. I think it was a bit of a daring choice. Yeah. And look how well they did. They had Bond for 15 years.
Yeah, it's going to be, I mean, for me, my money's, I would hope, for a good choice would be Cavill, because he was, I think, the second choice if Craig had said probably no, because I've gathered he was the runner-up. But, hey, the lap of the gods, the lap of Broccoli and Wilson.
I think Clive Owen was also in the running at that time as well. He would have been interesting. We'll see. We'll see. I have no doubt there will be another Bond series of movies. In fact, I always say there are three things certain in life. There's death, there's taxes, and then there's James Bond movies.
That's a very, very... What I also want to ask you about, Steve, because we've discussed Bond, and I'm hoping I've not, hammered you with too many questions. You've been asked probably hundreds upon hundreds of times in the past. But you also wrote a very interesting book, the Twilight Zone Encyclopaedia. So how, obviously we discussed your love of Bond, how you got into that. So how did you get into the Twilight Zone? Why were you motivated to write a book about that?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm out there trying to sell films and television series every day, which is very challenging. I mean, I've made some films. I've made 3 narrative films and 2 documentaries. I've gotten chips on the table, but literally decades can go by before you get another film going. It's like winning the lottery. So I said to myself one day that I got to get back to writing books. That was part of the motivation to do a 4th edition of the James Bond Movie Encyclopaedia. And I was looking around for another subject, and the Twilight Zone is just a evergreen television series. I'm talking about the first 5 seasons, black and white, 1959 to 1964. And I developed a relationship with Rod Serling's widow, Carol Serling, who, like Cubby Broccoli did back in the 70s, she opened her files to me. So there have been other books on the Twilight Zone. I'm particularly fond of Mark Zicree's book, The Twilight Zone Companion, which is a very good book. But then again, I really wanted to get out to the public this enormous cast over the 5 years of wonderful character actors whose names should stay out there. Burgess Meredith, Jack Klugman, Art Carney. It goes on, and up-and-comers like Robert Redford and Charles Bronson. These are people that were virtually unknown when they first came to Twilight Zone. It was an opportunity to really get knee-deep into this wonderful team that put together this marvelous show. So whereas Zicree's book focuses primarily on the plots of the 156 episodes, I do talk about the plot a little bit and behind the scenes, but I also get into the backgrounds of who were the performers that made this show come alive. And I interviewed everybody still living that I could find. And I thought the encyclopedia turned out really swell. It's a great little amalgam if you're sitting there and you're watching an episode with an actor named Albert Salmi. Nobody knows who Albert Salmi is today, but when you see his picture and you realize he was in 2 or 3 Twilight Zones, you get to know a little bit more about him. I think I've done my job.
And what are your favorite Twilight Zone episodes? I have one that always stands out, so I'm going to be interested to see if we have a common interest on this one or not.
Well, there's probably 20 that are your mainstays. You got to watch these 20 because they are on a 5-star basis. They're 6 stars. And one of my favorites is the Burgess Meredith episode where he plays the bookish little bank clerk who every day goes into the bank vault to eat his lunch and read the paper because nobody allows him to read. And then the world ends. That's one. That's called Time Enough at Last. And then, of course, To Serve Man is one of the more interesting ones with the great Richard Kiel from the James Bond movies. Yeah. He's great. But I have a tendency to like time travel more than anything. So some of the time traveling episodes are my best. In fact, part of the motivation to get heavily into Twilight Zone is one summer I decided that I was going to remake an episode of the Twilight Zone. So
wow.
A bunch of friends, we went out into the hinterlands with cooperation from the U.S. Marine Corps, and we remade The Seventh is Made Up of Phantoms. Now, as you may recall, that's an episode where a modern American tank crew is on maneuvers in South Dakota, and they go through some kind of warp, and they end up near the Battle of the Little Bighorn between General Custer and the Sioux and the Cheyenne and all the other tribes. And that was I kind of felt like I would like to direct something to see if I have any talent in directing. So it was kind of a little exercise for me. And we filmed it. One of the actors was Michael Cole, who starred in the Mod Squad television series on television. So I really enjoyed that. And there's just a lot of elements of the Twilight Zone. And actually, when I was at Showtime, I spent 10 years at Showtime, the American premium cable company. I developed, as a producer, a biography of Rod Serling with two wonderful writers. Unfortunately, it didn't gel. But someday we may go back to it.
I mean, if you think what Rod Serling created, it's in that kind of same thing as, Fleming with Bond. It's you almost can't imagine it not being around, but it's when you've got to consider how groundbreaking something like the Twilight Zone was, because there'd be nothing of that kind of style. And how much do we now know obviously it's been redone. It's become, we've got a modern iteration of it, but the theme song plays, immediately people are going to know what it is. Rod Serling does his beyond brilliant introduction style. He was a very frustrated writer. He wanted to deal with important issues of the day, but at television networks, the sponsors who sponsored those programs, they wanted nothing to do with modern issues. There's a story I think it's going to be made into a film now, about the young African-American boy, Emmett Till, who went to visit some relatives in the South and whistled at a white woman, and a gang of men grabbed him and hanged him from a light thing. It was just a horror story. When Rod said he wanted to tell that story on national television, he said, the network executive said, "You can do it, Rod, but you got to make him a Mexican." And that's the kind of stupidity that was involved in television in those days. They wouldn't let him tackle moral stories. So what happened was he used science fiction and fantasy to tell a lot of his morality plays, because the network executives didn't realize he was commenting on racism and anti-Semitism or any form of hatred he could meld into it. One of his stories, which is so resonant today, is called Eye of the Beholder, where the woman is having an operation to change her, plastic surgeon is going to change her face, and they remove the bandages, and she's a gorgeous blonde lady. It turned out it was Donna Douglas from the Beverly Hillbillies. That's Donna Douglas. And the camera turns around, and you see the nurses and doctors, and let's just say they don't look like you thought they would look like. I'm not going to spoil it for the fans. But this is a very, very strong attack on racism and conformity, which was very much in Rod's wheelhouse. He was also very anti-war. He's one of the first Hollywood people to protest the Vietnam War. He was a legend. I don't know how he would react today to what's going on in the American political atmosphere, but I have a feeling he would be on the front lines carrying signboards. Yeah, I don't think he'd be, how can I put it diplomatically, I don't think he'd be that impressed. I'm rather annoyed with myself for not remembering that it was Donna Douglas, but again, I know exactly what you mean about them not looking as you'd expect, because I remembered that, but I couldn't remember it was her.
I've learned over the years, don't assume that anybody watching or listening has seen everything you've seen, because the concept of spoilers is really is can be upsetting to people. I was in a theater in Los Angeles. We were screening The Great Escape, the great Steve McQueen, James Garner, Richard Attenborough, World War II POW adventure. And I made the mistake of talking a little bit about what was going on, and I got booed. People had not seen the movie, and they booed me. So I really kind of been very careful what I say about movies. And I know we broke the rule a little bit with No Time to Die, but I figure your listeners, if they haven't seen No Time to Die now, they're way behind the times.
It's very interesting when you mention the thing of spoiling, or expecting that people have seen things. Because one of the things I used to do is every year they do a showing at Christmas of It's a Wonderful Life at a cinema. I don't think they've been doing it so much recently, but you could go and see it. And I'd go and see it with my father. It was a shared interest we had. And you obviously assume that everyone has already seen it and is seeing it again and again. And there were people sat further down the row who never seen it, which amazed me. And they're having a wonderful reaction to it, having never seen it before.
What's surprising to me about that movie is it was not a hit when it came out.
No.
It was not a hit at all. And in fact, it forced the bankruptcy of Frank Capra's independent company, Liberty Films. It did not make enough money to keep the company afloat. But it's one of my all-time favorite movies. I mean, my goodness. It should be required watching for everybody.
And what I find interesting about It's a Wonderful Life is, and almost it could go Twilight Zone if you think about it, everyone looks at it and says, what a wonderful, nice, happy, festive Christmas film it is. Yes, but I think they also miss the fact it is incredibly dark in part, incredibly dark. And even when I rewatch it, even though I've seen it many, many times, I know it, I'm still struck by that scene. I'm like, my God. There are some parts in it.
Well, I think that because it was released so soon after World War II,
yes,
I think the public was not ready to look at darkness again. They wanted brightness. So the other film that was released that year, which I just chronicled on my podcast, The Best Years of Our Lives, which was the best picture of 1946, that was the movie that made the most money, and that was. That was what people wanted to see in 1946. It'll be interesting to see how the movie business evolves in the next few years, because having gone to streaming as a powerful point of view for seeing films, I'm curious if we can get droves to come back to the cinema, because the kids are going. They're going to see Iron Man. They're going to see Spider-Man. They're seeing all the various mans. Also the various women's. There's Wonder Woman. But is the general public going to come back to the movies? And I think Hollywood's in a little bit of a rut right now, at least for the over 40-year-olds who are a little tired of the superhero genre, which is soaking up a lot of the money. Now, me personally, I'm trying to sell comedy. I feel comedy has almost completely disappeared from the theaters, except in cases where they have those raunchy hangover type comedies. But my writing partners and I are inspired by films like The Wizard of Oz, Back to the Future, Ghostbusters, Night at the Museum, fun family movies that you can take your grandmother to or your 8-year-old to, and we can have a wonderful, joyous time at the cinema without wincing. And I'm hoping to bring that back. We've got a number of projects that we're trying to get into the marketplace. And that's what I do pretty much most of the time when I'm not podcasting or talking to nice gentlemen like you.
Thank you. So how do you juggle all the hats?
Well, I have to focus more. See, when you write a screenplay, as good as it is, and you certainly hope it's good, it doesn't mean anything. You've got to find the director. You've got to find some actors. You've got to find some money. I mean, it's almost like nobody helps you. You have to do everything by yourself. Yes, you can submit it to agents and managers and studios, but they're not going to want to take a look at it if they don't know you. They've got enough hands full with the people they do know. So it's been a slow education, learning what you need to do to get the public's attention, or at least the executive's attention. And a lot of it is doing things on your own without having to depend on studios and networks, at least initially. So it's been difficult for me. I'm not making any money doing it, but my wife is one of the most understanding people on the planet, and we can still afford our mortgage, so we're okay. But it's a challenging business. I don't have to say that to you. I know you know. But I'm hopeful that we can bring comedy back to the planet at a time when we need to laugh more than ever. Because, yeah, it's just gotten to be depressing on so many fronts.
I'm going to ask you a Twilight. Well, because I've not said it, so I'm going to tell you my favorite Twilight Zone episode. I want to see what you think. It's Bill Shatner's on the airplane. It is Nightmare
at 20,000 feet.
Yeah.
They remade the episode in the movie with John Lithgow. I think they changed it to 30,000 feet because they were in a different kind of an airplane. But I love that episode. Most people don't realize it was directed by Richard Donner, who directed the Superman movies.
Yeah, and it was written by Richard Matheson, wasn't it? Who'd written he wrote Big Time Return, which became Summer in Time, and I Am Legend.
Incredible Shrinking Man.
Yeah.
Legend of Hell House. One of the great, he was on Rod Serling's writing team along with Charles Beaumont, and George Clayton Johnson. It's a wonderful episode. I spoke to Richard Matheson. He was sitting on an airplane one day on a flight somewhere, and he was looking out at a cloud, and he pictured somebody skiing off the cloud. And I think that eventually came to the idea of something on the wing related to those gremlins, which the mysterious gremlins, which were supposedly causing havoc during World War II. And there's a funny story about that episode. I talk about it in my book, where Richard Donner, as I mentioned, was directing. They were directing on one of the sound stages at MGM, which had a big tank, so they could pour water on the wing, and the water would go into the tank. And so there was a proper drainage. So he went to get coffee, and he heard a scream from the set, and he came running back, and there was William Shatner, having apparently fallen into the tank and was lying face down on the concrete. They thought he was dead, and then he whipped around and laughed at Donner, and they were pulling a little prank on him. So that was a little bit of a prank on Donner. And, of course, Nick Cravat played the creature on the wing in that episode. Nick Cravat was a very acrobatic actor. He used to be partnered with Burt Lancaster in a circus act when they were in the army in Italy. And
I did not know that.
Yeah, he's also Burt Lancaster's partners in those great movies, The Flame and the Arrow and The Crimson Pirate from the late 40s or in the early 50s. So, Nick was the creature on the wing.
It is a wonderful episode, and you also touched upon the film, which unfortunately has its own checkered history, shall we say, with things that happened in the making of that. How did you enjoy the film, the Twilight Zone, the movie? Which is, to be honest, how I, from a personal standpoint, first got into the Twilight Zone. I reverse engineered it. I saw that, and then I went back to the original TV series.
I liked it very much. I think that it's a great tragedy about the John Landis episode. A lot of care was put into that movie. They obviously loved the Twilight Zone, the way it's narrated by Burgess Meredith. Dan Aykroyd is wonderful in it. The various episodes were a little up and down, but I think the best episode is the Miller episode, the George Miller episode, which is a remake of Nightmare at 20,000 Feet with John Lithgow replacing Shatner. I think it has a wonderful Jerry Goldsmith score, which is a big plus. But it's just this is a movie that's always been has a cloud over it because of the great tragedy. For the listeners who are listening, there was a horrible accident on this film set where during a Vietnam battle sequence, a helicopter crashed and killed Vic Morrow, the actor, one of my favorites from the TV series Combat for many years, and 2 small Vietnamese children. So the project was always kind of just struck by a terrible tragedy.
Yeah, I mean, if you can say, the only positive thing that came from it is it strengthened up laws, didn't it, in relation to filmmaking, children being in film. But you're right, it does unfortunately leave quite a horrible shadow hanging over a film that generally will, as strange as it sounds for some of the segments, will make me smile when I see it. It's tricky on that. So, Steve, what did you think when we got a new series of the Twilight Zone, the most recent new iteration of it?
Well, I was dubious, because when they make the Twilight Zone in color, you lose about 50% of the atmosphere. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to all anthology. You know, over here, we're big fans of your Black Mirror series, which has been wonderful, and those shows are in color. But in terms, if you're going to slap the Twilight Zone on a TV series title, then I think black and white is the better way to go, because Rod Serling was very, very, his production team was very smart in that black and white, when you show something in black and white, it already is a little different than your world. And another thing I discovered in my research, today we're very comfortable with product placement. You know, you drive by a city, you see the typical signage you would see in any modern city. Sometimes the breakfast food on the table is what we would have for breakfast, or the TV shows in the background. In watching 156 episodes of The Twilight Zone, I discovered only 2 product placements in the whole series. One was an innocuous little oil sign in the first episode of a company that I'd never heard of, but it turned out was a real company. And then somebody has a Mickey Mouse watch on their wrist. In 156 episodes, that was the only example of product placement.
Whereas now it'd be
nothing to distract you from the story. It's an otherworldly story, and I think there was method behind their madness.
Yeah, I mean, I was incredibly dubious when I heard they were going to be doing a new Twilight Zone series. I enjoyed some of it. I didn't enjoy all of it.
I didn't get very far. I watched the first episode about the stand-up comic. I thought it was okay. But then when I got to the new iteration of Nightmare at 20,000 Feet with that iPad, I just hated that episode so much. I hated the way it ended. I thought it was awful. I didn't go back. I probably should sample it, but I didn't go back in 1980. And I didn't go back in 1986 either. I just didn't have any interest. It's kind of the same feeling I have about the Fleming novels. You know, when Ian Fleming stopped writing James Bond novels, I was done. I'm not interested in reading anybody else's James Bond novels. It's just me.
So I'm going to ask you one that I'm really interested in, because you mentioned the Twilight Zone. What do you think of The Outer Limits?
Well, The Outer Limits was a very, very intelligent series. Very intelligent. You know, going an hour long, gave you a lot of things to chew on. Very, very good series. I'm not as well up on it as I am with The Twilight Zone, but it's a very well-respected series, and some wonderful actors. And I'm surprised that Rod didn't write an episode or 2, because it was right up his alley.
I mean, I can inhabit both worlds on those. I love both of them. So I also want to ask, I always like to ask this question to people. So, Steve, you're given a blank template. You can create anything. It can be a film, it can be a book, it can be anything. What would your dream project be? There's no limitations to your creative funding abilities, whatever. It's your oyster.
Well, it's a project that my partner and I are developing right now. I have it already planned out. It's already written. It's the best thing we've written. It's time travel again, of course. And I'll basically give you the basic setup. We have a young woman, probably a high school senior, maybe 17 or 18 years old. She's an obsessed fan, and she is entirely in love with The Wizard of Oz. I mean, she sees it every Wednesday night. Everything about her life is about The Wizard of Oz. She's got it on her ringtone. She's got it on her answering machine. She has all the memorabilia. When she dresses for Halloween, of course she dresses as Dorothy every year. It's her thing. So her friend calls her up one day and says, listen, I hate to feed your unnatural obsession, but Sony Pictures is resurfacing Stage 27, and they've discovered some of the yellow bricks from the original Munchkin City. So she talks herself onto the lot as a reporter and is looking at this hole in the ground where they're excavating the soundstage. She sees the dusty yellow bricks, but then a little dog pops out of the hole who looks a lot like Toto. And she chases it out of the soundstage. It's about to be run over a car, and she hits her head, and she wakes up, and she's on the MGM lot in the year 1938, and they're making The Wizard of Oz.
Sold.
We call it because. And we're right now we're trying to position it to get it in the right hands. But that's our favorite movie, and there's a lot of twists and turns in the story, but it's the best thing we've written. And it's kind of a mixture of Back to the Future, Midnight in Paris, the Woody Allen movie, that kind of thing. But it all takes place at MGM during the making of The Wizard of Oz.
You've really got my attention on that. That sounds, and I don't blow smoke up people's backsides. That really does sound good. That really sounds good. You literally got me. That's a definite hook.
So if anybody's listening who has access to film financing, get in touch with James right away, because we need money. You know, that's just the way it works in Hollywood. You got to come in with some of the money, but we actually think we'll attract the right package. It's just a matter of time.
Oh, I think that sounds like a really good one. So if I can also just so we've looked to the future. If I can throw you backwards for a sec, if you could have worked on anything in the past, what would it have been? Good question. Having worked on film sets and been part of the crew for a lot of shows, I think that one of the films I would have liked to have worked on was one of the first films I wrote about, which is The Day the Earth Stood Still, working with Michael Rennie and Patricia Neal. Little Billy Gray would have been fun. Also the giant ant movie would have been fun to be in behind the scenes, you know, and taking press onto the set and visiting with the ants would have been fun. I cannot disagree with you on that. We're getting close to the wrap-up time, Steve. Can we have anything like can you tell us some of the links to your site, to your podcast, which I will be jumping straight on after we have done this. I'm going to be listening to your stuff. So anything you want to promote and give us links to, please. Oh, thank you so much, James. Well, I have a podcast. Right now it's called Steve Rubin's Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm about to change it to Stephen Jay Rubin's Saturday Night at the Movies for conformity. It's a classic film site. We interview people both behind the scenes and in front of the camera from the classic films, and authors, film historians. It's on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple. Those platforms carry it. It's free, of course. I have a lot of Facebook presence. I do a classic film review on Facebook every Saturday under Steve Rubin Saturday Night at the Movie. Again, Stephen J. Rubin Saturday Night at the Movies. I have a second site called Classic Film Lollapalooza, which I also post on. And then I have a website. It's StephenJRubin.com, and J is spelled out Jay. And those are my principal. I'm on Instagram. I'm on LinkedIn. I do some Twittering. But if you type in Stephen J. Rubin in any of those platforms, you'll find me. And I thank you so much for the opportunity. You'll hear about these movie projects hopefully soon. If you want to buy the James Bond Movie Encyclopaedia, it's available on Amazon. Sometimes it's in your bookstore. The Twilight Zone Encyclopedia is also available on Amazon. That's about it for now. Well, thank you so much for coming onto the show and talking to me. It's been great. And I will say for the listeners, get the books. They are well worth buying. They are very good reads. I cannot thank you enough for doing this with me, for having a chat with me and discussing things. And I have to be honest, I know I have to rein myself in time-wise because Gemma does shout at me if I go over time, because I could have spoke to you for hours and hours.
You're a terrific interviewer, James. I enjoyed your questions.
Thank you. And can I ask one other favour? When the film gets made, the time-travelling Wizard of Oz film, can we have you back on, please?
100%. I will definitely be there with bells on.
Thank you. So we've been talking of celluloid codswallop in this episode. So it is remains just to say thank you for tuning in and listening. And Steve, thank you for your time and telling us all about your work.
Thank you, James. Be well and have a great rest of your week.
You too.